Well, if he wants her to tell him about it, she will, but if he does not want to know about it, it's the same as if she never knew it. Because to her, the only knowledge that's important is what he knows and what pleases him, because she wants the system, doesn't she? Well, one lady took the seminar, and she called me up the next day, and she says, I want to thank you for the seminar. She says, I have been a typical 20th century housewife, and I've bossed my way around, and I've done my level best to assume half the responsibility of this household, which was my normal duty, I thought. She said, last night when I was in the seminar, she says, as you talked, and as you went from point to point, she said, I discovered deep within me, you were describing what I wanted to be. This is something for her to come right out and tell me this. But a husband should want his wife to grow to reach her maximum potential. In other words, he should want her to learn everything she can. You got to watch this submission, because when you say, if that's what he wants, even if it's wrong, that's what she does. I'm thinking of a case in Eugene. They took a trip. He drives illegal, to say the least. And this bothers her. So on the trip, they ended up in a real fight. They started out and they were going to practice role relationship and have a wonderful trip, and everything was going to just be beautiful. But she couldn't take the driving anymore, so she just blasted. Now let's contrast that with my wife. I have told my wife that any time you see me doing anything wrong in driving, I want you to tell me immediately. Now, for my wife to be submissive, what does she have to do? Tell me everything that there's any way I could improve the driving. Now, I have done this because I want to live. And I want every bit of help I can have when I'm driving to make sure that I live. Well, this particular gentleman in Eugene, does he want his wife to help him? No. And since she does, is there a contest? Now, is it right what he wants? No, it's not. But does she have to do something that isn't right to be submissive? Yes. And I know this gets awfully hard because we're dealing with what is right. And in our society, what is right is very precious. But we're saying that when she gets in that car to go with him, she has to be submissive, which means that she'd tell him how to drive. No, she shuts up and he takes over and he drives the way he wants. Does that show you the difference in what submission can be between two husbands? Now, if she would let him drive the way he wants, I would think that he probably would get into an accident now and then, get some tickets, and would eventually probably grow up. I think he relies a lot on her nagging. The question can be asked, when there are children and the wife is playing the male role to the children, how does she please her husband? The best way to answer this question is that when a wife marries a husband, she has given herself to him. Everything that she has is now his, and it's outright ownership. Therefore, he decides he wants to have a child. She has the child for him, not for her. We've got this concept a little mixed up in our society. Women think that the kids are theirs. They think the house is theirs, but it's not true. She's having the child for him. Now, if she has it for herself, she'll have more pain than if she has it for him. Can you see why? If she's having it for him, is she doing something for the man that she loves? Then there's not so much self-centeredness in the childbirth. And it's a beautiful experience for her. And after she has the baby, has she been able to give him something he couldn't have any other way? Is this real satisfaction for her? So then she gives the child to him, and she takes care of it for him. Then is there any conflict of interest? None whatsoever. He wants her to take care of his child. This can be illustrated in another way. This couple were in bed sleeping. He moved too close to her. She said, "You're on my side of the bed again." He woke up half asleep and he says, "I don't think so." She says, "I'm sure." And he says, "All right." He says, "Where's my shoulder?" She says, "Right there." He says, "Put your finger on the sheet right where it comes to." So she did. He says, "Hold it there and don't move." So he got up and hunted all over until he found a ruler. He measured off the bed to prove he was right. Now, he's figuring that who owns the bed? This is interesting. Who owns the marriage bed? Well, according to their argument, it was a 50-50, but it isn't. He owns it. Well, I'll give you an illustration. I give my little boys calves and lambs. Now, anything I give them is whose? Mine. Otherwise, they would be breeding and running big flocks, and pretty soon I would say, may I put my cows in this field? No, we're going to use this field. Would I have conflict on my ranch? Like I give my wife a Cadillac convertible. Whose car is it? It's my car. There's not any question about it. In other words, if you believe in this, can you give everything you've got away? And can you still have it? Now, to understand this, we'll go back to God. Did God give everything in the world to Christ? Did he lose anything? No, he still got it all. So Christ turns around and did what? You follow the scriptures, he turned around and gave everything he had to all the Christians. Did he lose anything? No, because who he gave it to, he owned. Therefore, you don't lose anything. So, a man comes home, and if he's clever, he gives the bedroom to who? Gives it to his wife. In other words, now she feels this is a special thing. But whose is it? His. Now, if you really understand real relationship, you'll do the same thing God the Father's done. You'll take everything you've got and give it to all the people under you. Do they feel happy now? And you haven't lost a single thing. In a situation of real love, I can't see where body contact is obnoxious. And if you are in a contest, I recommend twin beds. And a contest is when they're only desirous of each other at intervals because of physical necessities. Real love is just as interested in cuddling after intercourse as before, without any exception. Physical sex wants what after intercourse? Nothing. Be left alone. Don't touch me. So you see, you need twin beds if you're in a contest. In other words, we say, do you still have intercourse when you're in a contest? Of course you do. You've got to. You're physical human beings with desires and needs. But after intercourse, is it over for however long a time you go? But in a real relationship with love, what do you want continuously? To touch, to feel, to be close to share. So there's always companionship. So you don't have to worry about physical contact being obnoxious. You can understand this a little better. If they were dead, what would you give for one touch? You talk to a widow who sleeps in that bed for a year without him. Would she complain if he touched her? Would she be out with a ruler measuring the bed? Boy, she'd give anything if he could just be there any way, shape, or form. I mean, it wouldn't matter. Can you see the difference of what love is and what contest is? Another real exciting principle that we can learn tonight from the material that we've already covered is what I'm going to call our glory diagram. This is where we end up with actual glorification. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take God the Father as an illustration. Now, up until the time that Christ came on the world, nobody knew who he was. And we didn't believe. We had different ideas, different concepts, but we really didn't know. Now, what did Jesus do for 3 years? He walked around on this earth telling us that God was great. In fact, I remember one time when somebody called him good. Now, to show you how much this was a part of him, he became so indignant that he reduced himself to nothing by raising God so much greater than him. In other words, we say that the gap between Christ and the Father had been actually moved as far as the human imagination could go. Now, he really wasn't trying to do anything that he didn't know what he was doing, because we know in a prayer he mentioned for the Father to glorify him as if it had already been planned before. Now, then the Father comes down and raises Christ to the position that Christ had raised the Father. Now, this is real hurriedly what we mean by the glorification concept. Now, let's bring it to an American home. The husband is gone all day. And the wife has spent the whole time telling the children that he's the greatest man on earth. This is the king. Finally, she gets it across in their minds. It's about time for the king to come home. Now, can you imagine how those little children feel when they realize the greatest man that ever lived, the king of the centuries, is about to come home? They hear a footstep outside the door, and they rush as fast as they can rush to the door. And in walks the King of the universe in all of his glory. Now, the mother has been with him all day. She's common. But one day, the children have a very special privilege. Guess who's going to be the babysitter while Mommy goes shopping? The king. Now, as the king is sitting around in a chair relaxing, and Mommy is gone, he casually mentions that it's very fortunate that they are all living in this generation. Little Junior says, "What do you mean, living in this generation?" He said, "Well, this is the generation when the greatest woman that ever lived is living." They begin to ask him some more questions. Who is this special woman? He said, "Well, that's the real uniqueness of the whole thing. She happens to live in this house." Now, this is quite a shock for the children. They suddenly discover that their mother is the greatest woman that ever lived. And he begins to tell them how wonderful it is and how it was just fortunate that he met her and how that he was able to actually marry her. Now they're beginning to realize he tells us that Mother is as great as what we thought he was. Now, this is the way that a man exalts himself. And this is the very same way that God the Father has exalted himself. Now, I'd like to give you an interesting fact. Jesus Christ said he was truth. Yet he also said if he would try to exalt himself, he would become a liar. I'm introducing you tonight to a universal law. It is impossible to exalt yourself. You just can't do it. I'll give you an illustration. Let's assume tonight, after the seminar, I go home. And I decide it's about time my boys found out who I am. I can't wait any longer. So I wake them up, and I tell them that I've been thinking for about 3 years now how you can find out how great I am, and I've come to the conclusion if I don't tell you, you'll never know. You just think I go to town to shop or to look at a piece of property, but I want to tell you the truth. I'm the greatest man in the state of Oregon. People all over the whole state look up to me. And I want you to know that your father's just not a ditch digger. He's a great man. They sit there and they listen to me, and I think I'm really becoming great in their eyes. The next day, let's assume that we have company at the ranch. And I hear the children talking with my children out by the window, and I go to the edge of the window to listen to hear what they're going to tell these children. And I get really excited because I can hear my little boy telling the others, "You know, our dad talked to us last night." Now I'm waiting for the rewards. In other words, they're going to tell how great I am to these other kids. And then the little boy says, "You know, we used to think we had a pretty great dad until last night." Last night he called us in, had a little conference with us. And you know, after we left him, we had our own conference. And we've come to the conclusion that our dad's crazy. You know, if we've got a king living in this house and we've got a queen, it's not too long till Junior puts 1 and 2 together and he comes to the conclusion he must be a prince. Now, what does this do for his self-image? I'd like to contrast this with what I call the LCD method. It comes from mathematics, and it stands for least common denominator. It means that I reduce everything to the lowest actual fraction in this mathematical problem. Now, how do we use this in our actual problem with the Americans in our homes? Now, if we believe in democracy, we give everybody an equal vote. We have the 2 children in this home. They have 2 votes, and the parents 2 votes. We have 4 votes. You You see, the man's first mistake was the first child. Because while he's at work all day, the mother's lobbying. There's 2 votes against him, and he never can have another decision in his favor. Now, I'd like to give you the fallacy of the least common denominator method. I used to go fishing, and I had a float. And when I would throw this float out on the water, if it would land sideways or flat, I'd watch it for just a few seconds, and then slowly it would begin to move, and it would turn straight up and down in a vertical position. Now, the hierarchy system that we've described tonight in our glorification diagram is just like that float. It has to go straight up and down. Now, in the glorification concept, we have set it up with the highest being at the top on the regular chain of command. Now, in our LCD method, we've tried to go against nature and have a parallel concept. Now, what this means, and you'll notice on the board, we have a straight line with the father, the mother, and the children all equal. Now, we want to be fair about it, but according to our fishing diagram, what happens to the parallel line? It tilts. And I'm afraid to tell you tonight that it'll never tilt in your favor. It'll tilt up until you'll begin to hear an expression, the old man. Then you'll realize you've got a hierarchy diagram all right, but who's on the bottom? And I think this becomes a little humiliating. The old man, poor father, is supposed to get out and do some work, bring in some money. And the children, in their attempt to raise themselves, find that they are on the hierarchy with the father, and the lower they have pushed the father down, the lower they have gone down. Now, when we come back to our glorification concept, when Jesus Christ raised God the Father as high as the imagination could be, and then God the Father raised Jesus Christ as high as the imagination could be, we have 2 imaginations. Therefore, we have expanded the imagination in our idea of who God the Father is. Now, back to our American home. When the husband has built the wife up, and the wife has built the husband up, and we know that there is an actual gap in the chain of command between the two, we say that the children used to think the father was king, but now the mother is on the level that they thought the father was on, which has actually exploded their imagination. Now, if you get this on a real good chain of command of about 10 people, we say that the person on the top, the imagination is now 10 times what was humanly possible in the beginning. All right, now, let's reverse this on the LCD method when the float reverses and puts the top on the bottom. The father was bad, but then we find out the mother is worse, which pushes the father further down. Now, what happens to Junior? Well, he's on the top of the hierarchy now, but the hierarchy has gone so far in the hole that Junior's lower than he would have ever been in the glorification concept. This leads us right into a problem that we have in our role relationship diagram. We mentioned earlier informational authority, and society has said this is power and this is backed by society. Now, what does this do to the male role? First of all, there's no security in the male role because the female role can pull your positional authority. All she has to do is pull the judge role, and then you've lost your positional authority. Now, what does this tend to do? It weakens the authority in the male role. And I'll give you an illustration. He asked this question to himself. I wonder what will make her happy now. And he becomes a little soft, we say. In other words, he walks with soft feet. He puts out feelers to find out how she feels because he wants to please her. Let me give you a statement. And I think this will show you the problem that we're getting into. When a man does not recognize his authority from above, but begins to think that some of his authority, even if it's a small amount, comes from below, we say that he has destroyed his manhood. Now, when you've destroyed your manhood, you are in a very weakened position and you tend to lose your positional authority every time you turn around. Now, let's go through why this is an increasing problem in our society today. First of all, society has declared that power is no longer physical force. And therefore, we say demand authority is physical force. So we have weakened the fighting position by taking away the physical force or the demand authority from the male side. Now, what have we done to the female side? Well, we've said that knowledge is power, and the informational authority of the female side is based on the assumption that knowledge is power. Right now, what happens is that the female role finds knowledge, uses it as power, pulls the judge role, strips the male of positional authority, then he feels threatened, and when he's stripped of his positional authority, he's tempted to pull demand authority, which is outlawed by society as physical force, and then he's whipped. In other words, he has lost his role relationship, and then we say that the meeting of the two people is no longer goal-oriented, no longer productive, but trying to win the battle. Let me give you an illustration of this. Let's go back to a movie in the early part of the United States when we had the Indian fights, the cavalry, the bugle. And I want to give you a typical scene that appeared in many of these films. What we have to have is a private who is rebellious and a lieutenant who is tough. And finally, in exasperation, the lieutenant takes off his hat with the bars on it, takes off his coat, lays them aside, and then challenges the private on demand authority. Normally in this type of film, the lieutenant thoroughly wipes the ground up with the private. After he's accomplished this feat, he walks over, dusts himself off, puts his coat and hat back on. Now, what has he done? Well, when he originally took off his coat, he willfully gave up positional authority. Then, during the course of the scuffle, he fought with demand authority. Now, when he puts his coat back on, he's going to try to have the private respect the position, but in reality, the private is respecting the demand authority and there's no role relationship. I think there's another illustration that will show you the pendulum swing in our society, which is moving toward more and more protection for the female role, more and more fairness, more and more equality. And these moves tend to destroy the strength of the male role. Have you ever heard of an illustration where a man committed a crime? And he fought it in this court, and he fought it in that court. What we're talking about is Court of Appeals. 7 years later, we still don't know whether he's guilty or innocent. He's still fighting. Let's take another illustration. The power that the unions have developed. Let's take even another illustration. Let's use our educational institutions. I like to go to a university in the eastern part of the United States. At this particular school, the final decision of whether a president is to be president of this university is determined by student vote. Now, once they actually arrived at this much power, they have gone into the extent of determining the curriculum, course content. We say then that power is coming from the bottom up. Let's compare this with the same thing that's happening, only in a different way, in another school in the western United States. The legislative body of this state wanted to actually give $500,000 to the professors for salary increases. They didn't trust the deans to administer this money fairly. And they thought the only people who could really do a good job would be the students. Now, the students were to vote on which professors were to receive the money. I think it's very interesting to know that they would not announce which professors had received the pay increases until the professors would turn the grades in. Does this sound like a little contest? It also means authority is coming from the bottom up. I could spend hours describing the pendulum swing of how the female role is being trained more, with more education and more actual ways that society has set up for the female role to contest, that you would actually get a feeling before I was through, why even play the male role? Is it worth it? In other words, why get married? She'll turn around and divorce you. Why have children? They'll run away from home. Why even buy a business and hire employees? They'll call a strike on you. If all you had tonight was positional authority, and if you were trying to practice a role relationship in this society, then I would agree with you. Forget the male role. And we'd be like everybody else. We'd run from responsibility. But I'd like to share with you tonight a fascinating concept. Literally a freeing idea, so that the male role, instead of becoming something to be dreaded, becomes one of the greatest challenges on earth. Now, to go into this, I'm going to introduce you to the new concept called earned authority. Earned authority, in its barest essentials, is what we call love. And it's based on our assumption tonight that real power is love. Now, it's not just any kind of love, it's delegated love. And I'd like to tell you tonight that delegated love is the only kind of love that we really have. Now, if you'll look in your manual, in the diagram of earned authority, you'll find two concepts. Power, which we're designated as P1, and another kind of power that we're calling P2. Now, when we put P1 and P2 together, you have what we call complete power. The best way I know to illustrate this is to give the idea of a two-way street. Communication has this same concept. In other words, if there's not two ways, then it doesn't work. Those of you who understand electricity will know exactly what I mean when I tell you a ground wire. In other words, electricity, as wonderful as it is, will not work if we do not run a second wire coming back. And by the way, this law is throughout the whole universe. Nothing works until it's connected both ways. Now, this is what we call giving and receiving. Now, the positional authority is love from above. This is what we meant by delegated love. It comes down through the chain and is power, and we're going to designate it as P1. But is it complete power?